It's 1939 and winter is fast approaching. Nazi Germany has made shocking advances in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and the fate of Europe hangs in the balance. But the full extent of the carnage to come is not yet known. There's a brief lull while armies regroup and plans are made. Something of a calm before the storm. Up in the far northeast, however, on the frontier where Europe proper ends and the Soviet Union begins, the situation is decidedly less calm. An immense conflict is about to erupt. Winter is coming and it will bring with it the Winter War. The first bloody chapter in a struggle for survival as Finland stands almost alone against the might of the Red Army. For more than a century, Finns had found themselves in the center of a violent tug-of-war between Russia in the east and Sweden in the west. In 1917 though, as the Russian Empire fell apart, a newly independent Finland had the chance to command its own destiny. After a tumultuous 2 decades of political strife, civil war and skirmishes along the border with Russia, Finland reached the end of the 1930s in a mood of cautious optimism. A non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union looked to bring stability, while the economy was booming through increased cooperation with the Scandinavian nations. In 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact put an end to this optimism. As the Red Army and the Wehrmacht carved up Poland, Finland watched as the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania accepted ultimatums from the Soviets, effectively signing away their futures. When Moscow reached out to Helsinki with a similar land exchange deal, which would push back the Finnish-Soviet border by 16 miles in the USSR's favor, ostensibly to protect Leningrad with a buffer zone, there was only going to be one answer. Finland would not accept such terms. The shells that smashed into Mainila on November 26, 1939, seemed to come from the west, from Finland. In the village on the Soviet side of the border, 4 Soviet border guards lay dead, with 9 wounded. This was an assault, an act of aggression from the Finns after land exchange negotiations broke down. Only, it wasn't. The historical consensus is that this was a false flag operation planned by the Soviet Union to provide a pretext for war. A few days later, on November 30th, the Soviets invaded with 21 divisions, 450,000 men in total. Bombs rocked the Finnish capital, Helsinki, killing civilians and damaging infrastructure. It was these bombs that Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov passed off as humanitarian aid to a concerned international community, giving rise to the term Molotov breadbaskets. The Molotov cocktails of the Finnish response would not be far behind. The disparity in resources was vast. The Finns could just about muster a comparable force in terms of manpower, about 340,000 men at the height of the war, but these were largely reservists, and they certainly were not deployed and ready to go at the border. The USSR also had 3,880 aircraft to the less than 114 of the Finnish Air Force, of which only around 30 were modern interceptors, and thousands of modern tanks to Finland's 32 of World War I vintage. But the Finns did have advantages. The purges of the 1930s had left the Soviet Red Army bereft of some of its top generals and officers. The USSR also reckoned with the staunch resistance of the Finnish defenders. If they believed Finland would be a pushover, they were sorely mistaken. Attacking along the Karelian Isthmus at the beginning of December is a massive undertaking. Winter temperatures can drop as low as minus 40 degrees Celsius, and a thick blanket of snow covers everything. While the swampy terrain is largely frozen, logistics quickly become difficult in this part of the world, and the land the Soviets passed over was largely undeveloped, not the best place to launch a massive invasion. Further north, in locations like Murmansk, Soviet troops would have encountered even more frigid temperatures on their push westwards. The terrain certainly suited defenders rather than attackers, but it also would have been more familiar ground for the Finns. With a better knowledge of the terrain and its conditions, the Finnish troops immediately had a slim advantage, but they'd still need to hold their nerve in the face of a huge onslaught. For a week, the Finns bided their time. By December 7th, the Soviets had reached Suomussalmi, the first major objectives as the Russians sought to reach Oulu and cut Finland in half. But Finnish troops had not stood idly by. They'd destroyed potential rest and resupply spots on the way to Suomussalmi, and the Red Army that arrived there was already exhausted and overstretched. On December 8th and 9th, the Finnish resistors launched their assault. In fierce fighting, they suffered heavy losses, and after 2 days of action, the village remained in Russian hands. The Soviets, now under siege, attempted a breakout on Christmas Eve 1939, but were beaten back. 3 days later, a third Finnish assault was unleashed on Suomussalmi, and the Soviets crumbled. They fell back desperately to the border, entangling chaotically with the reserve force, the 44th Rifle Division, along the road back east. It was a huge but costly Finnish victory. While the Soviets were still reaching Suomussalmi, the Finnish 24th Regiment was digging in along the Kola River. A Soviet victory here could see the Red Army outflank the Finnish defenders and bypass the Mannheim line. Kola had to hold. Here, the preparedness and equipment of the Finns would work in their favour. While the Finnish guerrillas moved over the harsh terrain on skis and with sleds, the Russians had no such capability. Their advance was confined to roads, which made life easier for the defenders. Still, a massive artillery bombardment unleashed 40,000 shells on the defensive line in a single day, while the Finnish guns could only manage 1,000 at best. The action at Suomussalmi would last weeks. Kola would see months of fighting. Several times, the Soviets breached the line but were pushed back again and again. Heavily outnumbered, the Finns fought on with astonishing bravery. At the grimly named Killer Hill, one point of defense along the line, 32 Finnish troops held out against an entire Soviet regiment, killing 400 of their enemies and losing all but 4 of their own men. At one stage of the battle, Major General Hägglund asked Lieutenant Arne Juutilainen a stark question: will Kola hold? The reply was simple: Kola will hold. For generations of Finns right up to the present day, the native phrase of Kola will hold remains a powerful expression of national pride and determination. As the Soviets fell back from Suomussalmi, the 44th Rifle Division was tasked with remaining in place and holding the vital strategic road. But now, the Finns were on the offensive. In the first week of 1940, Finnish units unleashed a devastating tactic. Moving in swift guerrilla formations, they isolated and cut off groups of the 44th and slaughtered them. This approach, known as Motti, from the Finnish word for a small bundle of sticks, devastated the Russian lines and tipped the balance in favor of the Finns. Already suffering from frostbite and sickness and reeling from heavy losses, the Soviet troops experienced an enormous dip in morale. They also lost control of supply lines from the border. The invasion was floundering after only a few weeks. As the carnage of the Second World War unfolded, the Finnish struggle was unfairly sidelined and is not nearly as well known as it should be these days. However, in the first months of 1940, this was a significant event. With the situation quiet in Western Europe and with the Japanese attack on the USA still almost 2 years away, the eyes of the world were trained on Finland. Sweden provided almost 9,000 volunteer troops to help the Finns, along with a detachment of fighter planes and anti-aircraft guns. These were joined by more than 1,000 Danes and more than 700 troops from Norway. Hungary, Italy, and Estonia also provided volunteer fighters, and global opinion was squarely on the Finnish side. Still, the bulk of the fighting was done by the Finns themselves, and the much smaller nation on the Russian frontier was largely alone in its fight against the Soviet aggressor. The Finnish resistors had fought bravely and performed superbly. They shattered the Soviet advance and pushed large swaths of the Red Army back to the border. But the USSR wasn't done. In February, they launched a massive assault, bringing their almost inexhaustible resources to bear on Finland. Pushed back to the Mannerheim Line, a fortified network of bunkers and emplacements, and even beyond in some cases, a shattered Finnish force now sought peace. In March 1940, the war came to an end. The Treaty of Moscow affirmed peace and redrew Soviet-Finnish borders. Finland lost 9% of its territory and 13% of its economic assets in the process. On putting his signature to the treaty, Finnish President Kyösti Kallio reportedly said, "Let the hand wither that signs this monstrous treaty." In a sense, the Soviets had won. They finished the war with more territory than they had begun with, although they paid for these small gains with enormous loss of life and material. They'd also weakened their position on the global stage, and the bloody months of December and January were said to have put the idea in Hitler's head that an invasion of the USSR could be successful. The Finns had lost territory. They'd also lost a significant number of their armed forces and civilians. But they'd retained their sovereignty, and they'd won enormous respect from the international community. Kolla did hold, and Finland did remain standing. The Winter War was not the end of bloodshed on Finnish soil. In 1941, as Finland once again attempted to navigate the precarious road of sovereignty and the threat of Nazi occupation, Finns found themselves fighting along the Wehrmacht as the continuation war renewed hostilities with the Soviet Union. This war lasted far longer, almost 3 years, and culminated in a massive Soviet offensive launched in concert with the Normandy landings in France. Even late in the day, as the weakened Germans struggled to resist and the uneasy partnership between Finland and the Third Reich wore thin, Finnish forces managed to score victories, including at the Battle of Ilomantsi, which ran from July to August. The staunch resistance gave Finland a relatively strong hand at the negotiating table, and another set of Moscow Accords in August 1944 brought peace back to Finland. Once again, Finland had defended its sovereignty, but this time, 11% of Finnish territory lay under Soviet control. To this day, the occupied territories are a sticking point in Finnish-Russian relations. The Winter War and the continuation war that followed cost Finland dear. Almost 26,000 Finns died in the first conflict and more than 63,000 in the second. The bloody struggle had plunged Finland into an existential crisis, and a fractious alliance with Germany proved to be the only way to secure survival for a country that had been independent for just a quarter of a century. In the end, she prevailed, and the post-war economic and social successes of Finland are a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of the nation and her people. To an outside observer, it looks like things could have gone either way. But for the Finnish resistors during the winter and continuation wars, there was only ever going to be one outcome.